In 34 years on the throne, Catherine the Great added roughly 200,000 square miles of territory to the Russian Empire. That is an area larger than the entire country of France, absorbed through a combination of military conquest, ruthless diplomacy, and strategic alliance. She founded more than 100 new cities. She corresponded personally with Voltaire, Diderot, and the great thinkers of the European Enlightenment, exchanging letters that shaped policy across a continent. She built the Hermitage, one of the largest and most celebrated art museums in the world, filling it with tens of thousands of paintings, sculptures, and artifacts collected from across Europe. And she accomplished all of this starting from a position of almost total powerlessness. A foreign-born woman with no legal claim to the Russian throne, married to a man who despised her, surrounded by courtiers who underestimated her at every turn. The scale of what she achieved is almost impossible to comprehend. But numbers alone cannot tell the story of how she did it. Behind every conquest, every reform, every glittering cultural triumph, there was a woman making difficult and often ruthless choices in a world that had been built entirely by and for men. How did she navigate it? How did she survive it? And what did it cost her? In this documentary, we will piece together the full story of one of history's most formidable rulers. On the 2nd of May, 1729, in the provincial Prussian city of Stettin, a child was born who would one day command the largest empire on earth. No trumpets announced her arrival. No courtiers waited in gilded halls. Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst entered the world quietly in a modest garrison town on the Baltic coast, the daughter of a minor German prince who could barely afford the trappings of his own nobility. Her father, Prince Christian August of Anhalt-Zerbst, was a man of limited ambition and considerable decency. A Prussian military officer who had worked his way to the rank of general, he governed Stettin with quiet competence and raised his daughter with genuine affection. He would never be a powerful man. His principality was small, his income modest, his influence negligible in the vast constellation of European courts. But he gave his daughter something more durable than titles or wealth. He gave her stability, and he gave her his respect. Her mother was a different creature entirely. Johanna Elisabeth of Holstein-Gottorp was beautiful, restless, and consumed by social ambition. She moved through European aristocratic circles with the energy of someone who believed she deserved a far grander stage than Stettin provided. She corresponded with kings, cultivated connections, and kept one eye permanently fixed on the horizon, searching for opportunities that might elevate her family's standing. She was, by most accounts, a difficult mother, cold where her husband was warm, distracted where he was present. Yet even Johanna's relentless social scheming would prove useful to her daughter in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Into this household of contrasts, young Sophie absorbed everything. The city of Stettin was hardly Paris, but the intellectual currents of the age found their way even there. The Enlightenment was sweeping across Europe in the 1730s and 1740s, carried in the books and conversations of educated men and women who believed that reason, not tradition, should govern human affairs. Sophie's governess, a French woman named Babette Cardel, became perhaps the single greatest influence of her early childhood. Educated, witty, and deeply cultured, Cardel opened the young girl's mind to French language, French literature, and French philosophy. Sophie proved an extraordinary student, where other children of her station might have absorbed just enough learning to navigate a drawing room. Sophie consumed ideas with something approaching hunger. By the time she was 14, Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst was not the girl her modest origins might have predicted. She spoke French with elegance, thought with unusual clarity, and possessed a curiosity about the world that no small Prussian garrison town could satisfy for long. The question was not whether this remarkable girl would find a larger stage, The question was how far that stage might extend. The answer, it turned out, would come from the east, and it would come quickly. In the winter of 1743, Empress Elizabeth of Russia faced a problem that had preoccupied European monarchs for centuries. She needed an heir. More precisely, she needed a bride for her nephew, the Grand Duke Peter, whom she had designated to inherit the Russian throne. Peter was a strange, sickly young man of 15, more interested in toy soldiers than statecraft, already showing signs of the erratic temperament that would define his brief and disastrous reign. But his personal qualities for the moment were almost beside the point. Russia needed a succession, and Elizabeth needed a daughter-in-law. The search for a suitable bride drew in some of the sharpest political minds in Europe. Among them was Frederick the Great of Prussia, the calculating king who ruled just north of Sophie's own modest home. Frederick had his own reasons for wanting a Prussian hand close to the Russian throne. An alliance between Berlin and St. Petersburg would reshape the balance of European power. When the question of Peter's bride arose, Frederick did not hesitate. He recommended Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a girl he had almost certainly never met, but whose family connections and, crucially, whose mother's ambitions made her an attractive candidate. She was young, she was malleable, or so he assumed, and she came without the dangerous political entanglements of a more powerful dynasty. Elizabeth's invitation arrived like a thunderclap in the Anhalt-Zerbst household. Johanna, who had spent years cultivating exactly these kinds of connections, could scarcely contain her excitement. Sophie herself received the news with something more complicated than joy. She was 14 years old, and she was being summoned to the largest country on earth. The journey began in January of 1744, in the depths of a European winter that showed no mercy to travelers. Sophie and her mother set out from the familiar landscapes of northern Germany and traveled east, the cold deepening with every passing mile. The Russian winter was unlike anything Sophie had experienced. Temperatures plunged to levels that froze breath midair and turned the vast plains into a white, featureless silence stretching to the horizon in every direction. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying, and it was unlike anything Stettin had ever prepared her for. St. Petersburg, when they finally arrived, was a city of deliberate spectacle. Peter the Great had built it from nothing on the marshes of the Neva River, determined to create a capital that would announce Russia's arrival among the great powers of the world. Golden spires caught the winter light. Enormous palaces lined broad avenues. The Russian court moved with a formality and a grandeur that dwarfed anything Sophie had witnessed in the minor courts of Germany. Empress Elizabeth herself was a formidable presence. Tall, still handsome at 34, she commanded every room she entered with the absolute authority of a monarch who had seized her throne in a palace coup and never forgotten it. She received the young German princess with warmth, but the warmth of a woman accustomed to measuring everything and everyone against her own interests. Sophie measured everything in return. She watched, she listened, and she understood immediately that this glittering, dangerous world operated by rules entirely different from those she had learned in Stettin. To survive here, let alone to thrive, she would need to become something new. The transformation had already begun, and it would demand far more than anyone at that glittering court yet suspected. The transformation began with a name. On June 28, 1744, the young princess from Anhalt-Zerbst stood before the assembled Russian court and renounced the Lutheran faith of her birth. She had studied the Orthodox Catechism with fierce concentration, absorbing its prayers and liturgy in the same Russian language she had been teaching herself since the moment the Empress's invitation arrived. When the moment came, she recited the Orthodox confession of faith in Russian, without hesitation, without a German accent that anyone could detect. The court was astonished. Even the clergy who had prepared her for the ceremony exchanged glances of quiet surprise. Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst was gone. In her place stood Yekaterina Alexeyevna, Catherine. The name was not chosen carelessly. Elizabeth had selected it herself, a deliberate echo of her own mother, Catherine I, the peasant woman who had risen to become Peter the Great's empress. The symbolism was clear to everyone in that gilded hall. This German girl was being asked to become Russian, wholly and completely, in body and in name. Catherine accepted the challenge with everything she had. While other foreign brides at European courts clung to the comforts of their native language and customs, Catherine did the opposite. She stayed up past midnight studying Russian vocabulary. She hired tutors and wore them out with her questions. She embraced orthodoxy not as a political performance, but with what appeared to be genuine devotion, adopting its rituals and fasting practices with a discipline that impressed even the most skeptical observers at court. The Russian people who heard rumors of her efforts began to warm to her in return. Then fate intervened in the cruelest possible way and turned her suffering into an unexpected gift. In the winter of 1744 and into 1745, Catherine fell gravely ill with pleurisy. For weeks, she burned with fever, her body wasting as the court watched and worried. Johanna, her mother, suggested that a Lutheran pastor be brought to administer comfort. Catherine refused. She asked instead for her Orthodox confessor. It was a small gesture, but in the politics of the Russian court, small gestures were everything. Word spread quickly. The young princess, facing what many feared was her deathbed, had chosen Russia over the religion of her birth. When she finally recovered, pale and thin but alive, the Russian public received the news with something approaching relief. She had become, in some essential way, one of their own. The one figure who felt none of this warmth was her intended husband. Grand Duke Peter remained stubbornly, almost aggressively, German. He drilled toy soldiers in his apartments, spoke Russian poorly, and without apparent interest in improving, and made no secret of his admiration for Frederick of Prussia, an attitude that bordered on treasonous given the political tensions of the era. Where Catherine studied and observed and adapted, Peter retreated further into his own small, strange world. He was 16 years old and already a disappointment to virtually everyone who mattered at court, none more so than the empress who had placed such careful hopes in the match. Catherine observed her future husband with clear eyes and drew her conclusions quietly. She said little, complained nothing, and continued her relentless work of becoming indispensable to the world around her. The betrothal was formally celebrated in the summer of 1745. Amid extraordinary pageantry, fireworks over the Neva, banquets that lasted for days, and the kind of ceremonial splendor that only Russia could produce. To every observer, it looked like triumph. Catherine alone understood how much of the real battle still lay ahead. The wedding took place on August 21st, 1745, and it was by any measure one of the most spectacular celebrations the Russian Empire had ever staged. For 10 days, St. Petersburg feasted, danced, and marveled at fireworks that turned the summer sky into something from a dream. Empress Elizabeth spent lavishly, as she always did, ensuring that the union of her chosen heir and his German bride would be remembered across every European court. Catherine wore a gown of silver tissue. She was 16 years old and, by all outward appearances, radiantly happy. The doors closed. The celebrations ended, and the marriage revealed itself for what it truly was. Peter had no interest in his wife. He had no particular interest in women at all, at least not in the way expected of a husband. He preferred to spend his evenings drilling toy soldiers across the floor of the royal bedchamber, arranging wooden regiments with the concentration of a field marshal while Catherine lay in bed, awake, waiting, increasingly bewildered. He kept a kennel of dogs whose noise and smell filled their shared rooms. He played the violin badly and often. He had developed an almost worshipful obsession with Frederick II of Prussia, modeling his dress, his manners, and his military pretensions on a king who would have found him faintly absurd. In Holstein, the tiny German duchy Peter considered his true home and true identity, he found everything he wished Russia could be. Russia, in his view, was barbarous, unworthy. For Catherine, this was not merely loneliness. It was a kind of slow suffocation. She responded the only way her nature allowed. She read, voraciously, systematically, with the same intensity she had once applied to Orthodox theology and Russian grammar, Voltaire's letters on tolerance and reason, Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, which she would later mark up so heavily that the pages barely survived, Tacitus on the nature of power and the corruption of courts. She was educating herself in the architecture of governance, absorbing ideas that would shape her reign decades before that reign began. Where Peter played at soldiers, Catherine studied empires. She also found other consolations. The question of who fathered her son Paul, born in September of 1754, has occupied historians ever since. Catherine herself, in her private memoirs, strongly implied that Peter was not the father, pointing instead to Sergei Saltykov, a charming young courtier who had been among her closest companions in the years before Paul's birth. The truth remains unresolved. What is certain is that by the time Paul arrived, the marriage between Catherine and Peter was performance rather than a partnership maintained for political necessity and nothing else. Empress Elizabeth had her own verdict on the situation. She had brought Peter to Russia as a young boy, shaped her succession around him, and watched with growing dismay as he hardened into exactly the wrong kind of man. He was vain, erratic, and openly contemptuous of the country he was meant to one day lead. Elizabeth adored little Paul upon his birth and promptly removed him to her own apartments to be raised under her supervision, seeing in the infant a future that his father seemed incapable of providing. Catherine was not permitted to raise her own child. She was left alone again, with her books and her thoughts and the long corridors of a court that watched her carefully while offering her almost nothing. But those years of reading were not wasted. Something was forming inside her, slowly and deliberately, the way iron forms in extreme heat. The question was no longer whether Catherine would survive this marriage. The question was what she would become when it finally ended. The corridors of the Winter Palace had eyes. Everyone who survived in Elizabeth's court understood this instinctively, the way one understands cold or hunger. Words traveled through walls. Loyalties shifted like river ice in spring. To speak carelessly was to vanish, and Catherine, who had watched courtiers disappear into Siberian exile for lesser offenses than an unguarded opinion, had no intention of vanishing. Instead, she listened. She watched, and she chose her friendships with the precision of a chess player who could see 12 moves ahead. Chief among her early allies was Alexei Bestusier-Argumen, the imperial chancellor and one of the most formidable political minds in Russia. Bestusev was old, suspicious by temperament, and deeply anti-Prussian, which alone distinguished him from Peter's circle. He recognized in Catherine something rare at the Russian court, a person who actually understood foreign policy, who had read the dispatches and grasped the implications, who could speak to ambassadors as an intellectual equal rather than a decorative consort. The two developed a carefully coded understanding. He offered her access and information. She offered him a future, the implicit promise of favor when circumstances eventually changed. And circumstances, both understood, would change. Meanwhile, Catherine was not entirely without warmth in those years. Stanisław Poniatowski, a young Polish nobleman attached to the British diplomatic mission, arrived at court in 1755 and soon became a significant figure in her private life. He was intelligent, cultured, genuinely fond of her, and crucially, he was exactly the kind of man Peter was not. Their relationship lasted several years and produced, in 1757, a daughter named Anna who lived only 14 months. Catherine grieved quietly and moved forward, as she had learned to do. Around her, a faction was forming. Military officers who resented Peter's mockery of Russian arms, courtiers who found his behavior humiliating, senior officials who looked at the heir apparent and felt something between dread and contempt. Catherine did not organize this faction so much as become its natural center, the fixed point around which anxious loyalties could quietly gather. She attended Orthodox services with visible devotion. She spoke Russian with warmth and precision. She wore Russian dress on the right occasions and made certain the right people noticed. Every gesture was calculated and yet, in a strange way, not entirely dishonest. She had genuinely made Russia her own. Peter, by contrast, seemed to work actively against himself. The 7 Years' War, which drew in every major European power after 1756, placed his loyalties on grotesque public display. Russian armies were fighting Prussia. Russian soldiers were dying in battles against Frederick II. And Peter, the heir to the Russian throne, made no secret of his admiration for the Prussian king, toasting Frederick's health at dinner while news arrived of Russian casualties. He received Prussian officers with warmth. He wept, reportedly, when Russian victories caused Prussian setbacks. The court watched in disbelief. The army, which Catherine was carefully courting through its officers, watched with fury. Elizabeth, aging now and increasingly unwell, could not live forever. Everyone in the palace felt this truth like a change in the weather. When she died, Peter would become emperor, and what would become of Catherine then? The answer to that question was being assembled, quietly, in drawing rooms and antechambers, in whispered conversations after chapel, in the careful exchange of glances between people who needed no words to understand each other. Catherine's network was not yet a conspiracy, but it was becoming one. The clock was running. And somewhere in St. Petersburg, the guards regiments were paying very close attention to the woman who remembered all their names. On the 25th of December, 1761, Empress Elizabeth of Russia drew her final breath. She was 52 years old, worn through by years of excess, illness, and a steady decline that the court had watched with a mixture of grief and calculation. The woman who had ruled Russia for 2 decades, who had built palaces and fought wars and shaped the empire into a genuine European power, was gone. The Winter Palace fell into mourning. But not everyone wept. Peter III ascended the throne immediately, and within days it became clear that Russia was in serious trouble. He was 33 years old and had been preparing for this moment his entire adult life, yet nothing about his conduct suggested preparation. He moved through the rituals of imperial succession with the manner of a man who found them faintly ridiculous. He showed insufficient respect at Elizabeth's funeral, laughing during ceremonies, hurrying through the solemnities that Russian Orthodox tradition demanded. The court watched, stone-faced. The clergy watched with deepening alarm. The guards regiments, those same officers Catherine had spent years cultivating, watched with something approaching contempt. The foreign policy reversal came with breathtaking speed. Russia in 1761 stood in a powerful position in the 7 Years' War. Russian armies had pushed deep into Prussian territory. Berlin itself had been briefly occupied. Frederick II of Prussia, the King Peter so openly admired, was facing catastrophic defeat. Then, in a stroke, Peter threw it all away. He withdrew Russia from the war entirely. He returned all conquered Prussian territories without compensation, without negotiation, without extracting a single concession. The Treaty of Petersburg, signed in the spring of 1762, handed Frederick a rescue so complete that historians would later call it the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Russian soldiers had died by the thousands for these gains. Their sacrifice was surrendered for nothing more than Peter's personal admiration for the Prussian king. The army's fury was incandescent. He did not stop there. Peter moved against the Orthodox Church with the blunt force of someone who did not understand, or did not care, what the church meant to ordinary Russians. He ordered the secularization of church lands, stripping the clergy of vast estates they had held for generations. Religious icons were removed from chapels. Church services were to be reformed along Lutheran lines. For a deeply Orthodox nation, these were not merely policy changes. They were desecrations. The clergy, who had enormous influence over the Russian population, turned against him with a bitterness that would prove fatal. And through all of it, Peter seemed genuinely bewildered that anyone objected. He surrounded himself with Holstein courtiers, spoke German in preference to Russian, wore his Prussian military uniform with visible pride, and organized his Holstein troops in ceremonies that seemed designed to celebrate everything Russia's army was not. He was, in the most fundamental sense, a foreign ruler who made no effort to become Russian. In a country that Catherine had spent 17 years learning to love, or at least to appear to love, the contrast was devastating. By the late spring of 1762, the conditions for catastrophe were fully assembled. A humiliated army, an enraged clergy, a court that had lost faith in its emperor within weeks of his coronation, and somewhere at the center of the mounting crisis, a German-born princess who spoke Russian beautifully, attended every Orthodox service, and had spent years making precisely the right friends. The revolution that was coming would not be a popular uprising from the streets. It would come from inside the palace walls, carried out by the guards regiments who had sworn an oath to the crown. The only question remaining was who they would choose to put beneath it. The morning of June the 28th, 1762 began before sunrise. Catherine was asleep at Peterhof when Alexei Orlov arrived, urgent and barely composed, shaking her awake with 3 words that had been weeks in the making. The moment, he told her, had come. For months, Grigory Orlov and his 4 brothers had been moving quietly through the guards regiments, the Izmailovsky, the Simonovsky, the Preobrazhensky, the same elite units that had made and unmade Russian rulers before. These were not casual conversations. They were carefully constructed loyalties, built on shared grievances over Peter's humiliation of the military, on genuine admiration for the woman who had treated these officers as partners rather than subordinates, and in some cases on the promise of reward from a future empress. By late June, the conspiracy had enough weight behind it to move. Catherine dressed quickly and climbed into a carriage before dawn had fully broken over the Gulf of Finland. She rode hard toward St. Petersburg, toward the barracks where everything would be decided. She arrived at the Izmailovsky regiment first. The soldiers poured into the courtyard, still pulling on their uniforms, roused from sleep and finding before them a woman they recognized. A woman who spoke their language, who knew their commanders by name, who had cultivated this exact moment for years. The regimental priest appeared with a cross. Catherine stood before the assembled men and received their oath of allegiance. They swore her empress and autocrat of all Russia before the sun had fully risen. The Simonovsky regiment followed. Then the Preobrazhensky. One by one, the Great Guard formations transferred their loyalty in ceremonies conducted with the full weight of religious oath and military tradition. By mid-morning, Catherine was riding through the streets of St. Petersburg toward the Kazan Cathedral, surrounded by soldiers who had just remade the empire. The Archbishop met her there. The city, astonished and then jubilant, watched her pass. Word reached Peter III at Oranienbaum, where he had been preparing, with characteristic obliviousness, for a celebration. His response revealed everything about why the coup had succeeded so completely. He hesitated. He panicked. He sent confused messages to Catherine asking for negotiation when negotiation was already impossible. He considered sailing for Holstein. He considered rallying loyal troops, but the troops were gone. Frederick of Prussia, the king he had sacrificed Russia's military honor to save, was not coming to rescue him now. By the afternoon, the architect of Russia's humiliation was writing out his abdication. The document was almost pitiable in its simplicity. Peter surrendered the crown he had held for less than 200 days, signing away the Russian Empire in a letter addressed to the woman who had once been forced to bow to him. He was taken under guard to the estate at Rapsha, and Catherine, now in full military uniform mounted on a white horse named Brilliant, led the guards regiments back toward St. Petersburg in a procession that left no doubt about who ruled Russia. The crowds that gathered along the route were not performing loyalty. They were expressing something that Peter had never managed to earn, and Catherine had spent nearly 2 decades building. She was 33 years old, German by birth, Russian by every choice she had made since arriving in Moscow as a 14-year-old girl. She had learned the language, embraced the faith, survived the humiliations, and outlasted the doubts. And now she rode into the capital of the largest empire on earth as its undisputed sovereign. It had taken a single day. One morning of swift movement, one series of oaths administered at regimental barracks, and the course of Russian history had changed completely. No battlefield had been required. No blood had been shed. The ease of it was, in its own way, a measure of how thoroughly Peter had destroyed himself. Catherine had not seized the throne so much as stepped into the space he had abandoned. What she would build in that space, and what it would cost her, was only beginning to reveal itself. Peter III arrived at Rapsha under guard, stripped of empire, reduced to a man waiting in a country house while history moved on without him. The estate sat roughly 30 miles from St. Petersburg, close enough for Catherine to receive reports quickly, far enough to keep the deposed Tsar out of sight. He was watched over by Alexei Orlov, the younger and more volatile of the brothers who had engineered Catherine's rise, a man whose loyalty was absolute and whose temperament was not always governed by caution. The official accounts would later say that Peter spent his final days in reasonable comfort. He had asked for his violin, his dog, his favorite servant, and his mistress, Elizabeth Vorontsova. Most of these requests went unanswered. Whatever the precise conditions of his confinement, they lasted only days. On July the 17th, 1762, less than 3 weeks after the coup that had taken his crown, Peter III was dead. He was 34 years old. The official explanation issued by the imperial court was death by hemorrhoidal colic, an ailment so mundane that it seemed almost designed to discourage scrutiny. European courts were not persuaded. Frederick of Prussia, the very King Peter had prostrated himself before, expressed open skepticism. The courts of Versailles and Vienna noted the timing with pointed silence. A man in his 30s, inconveniently alive 1 week and conveniently dead the next, did not inspire confidence in the diagnosis. What makes the death genuinely difficult to assess, even now, is a letter. Alexei Orlov wrote to Catherine in the hours after Peter died, and the document has fascinated and troubled historians ever since. His words were confused, frightened, almost incoherent in places. He described a quarrel, a scuffle at the table, blows that had been struck before anyone understood what was happening. He begged Catherine's forgiveness. He seemed to be confessing to something while simultaneously suggesting it had been an accident and chaos rather than a plan. The letter raises as many questions as it answers. Did Orlov act on his own impulse, a violent man in an enclosed space with a helpless prisoner? Did he act on understood orders that were never written down? Or did something genuinely go wrong? A confrontation that spiraled past anyone's intentions? Catherine's own response to the letter, if she gave one in writing, has not survived. What survived was the problem the death created. Catherine could not mourn Peter publicly without inviting the question of why she had not protected him. She could not celebrate without confirming what much of Europe already suspected. She arranged a modest burial, declined to attend in person, and issued the official medical explanation with the determined composure of a ruler who understood that some questions could not be answered without making everything worse. The shadow never fully lifted. For the rest of her reign, and long after it, the death at Rapsha followed Catherine's reputation across Europe and through the pages of history. Her enemies would call her a murderer. Her defenders would argue she had no proven role in what happened. The truth, as with so much surrounding that particular summer, remains suspended somewhere between a frightened letter and an official silence. What is clear is that Peter's death solved an immediate problem and created an enduring one. A living deposed Tsar would have been a permanent invitation to conspiracy, a figurehead for every discontented nobleman and foreign power with ambitions in Russia. A dead one became a question she could never entirely escape. Catherine had secured her throne, but the ground beneath it and the nature of the power she now held would demand everything she had. The question now was what kind of ruler she intended to be. Peter III arrived at Rapsha under guard, stripped of empire, reduced to a man waiting in a country house while history moved on without him. The estate sat roughly 30 miles from St. Petersburg, close enough for Catherine to receive reports quickly, far enough to keep the deposed Tsar out of sight. He was watched over by Alexei Orlov, the younger and more volatile of the brothers who had engineered Catherine's rise, a man whose loyalty was absolute and whose temperament was not always governed by caution. The official accounts would later say that Peter spent his final days in reasonable comfort. He had asked for his violin, his dog, his favorite servant, and his mistress, Elizabeth Vorontsova. Most of these requests went unanswered. Whatever the precise conditions of his confinement, they lasted only days. On July the 17th, 1762, less than 3 weeks after the coup that had taken his crown, Peter III was dead. He was 34 years old. The official explanation issued by the imperial court was death by hemorrhoidal colic, an ailment so mundane that it seemed almost designed to discourage scrutiny. European courts were not persuaded. Frederick of Prussia, the very King Peter had prostrated himself before, expressed open skepticism. The courts of Versailles and Vienna noted the timing with pointed silence. A man in his 30s, inconveniently alive 1 week and conveniently dead the next, did not inspire confidence in the diagnosis. What makes the death genuinely difficult to assess, even now, is a letter. Alexei Orlov wrote to Catherine in the hours after Peter died, and the document has fascinated and troubled historians ever since. His words were confused, frightened, almost incoherent in places. He described a quarrel, a scuffle at the table, blows that had been struck before anyone understood what was happening. He begged Catherine's forgiveness. He seemed to be confessing to something while simultaneously suggesting it had been an accident and chaos rather than a plan. The letter raises as many questions as it answers. Did Orlov act on his own impulse, a violent man in an enclosed space with a helpless prisoner? Did he act on understood orders that were never written down? Or did something genuinely go wrong? A confrontation that spiraled past anyone's intentions? Catherine's own response to the letter, if she gave one in writing, has not survived. What survived was the problem the death created. Catherine could not mourn Peter publicly without inviting the question of why she had not protected him. She could not celebrate without confirming what much of Europe already suspected. She arranged a modest burial, declined to attend in person, and issued the official medical explanation with the determined composure of a ruler who understood that some questions could not be answered without making everything worse. the shadow never fully lifted. For the rest of her reign and long after it, the death at Rapsha followed Catherine's reputation across Europe and through the pages of history. Her enemies would call her a murderer. Her defenders would argue she had no proven role in what happened. The truth, as with so much surrounding that particular summer, remained suspended somewhere between a frightened letter and an official silence. What is clear is that Peter's death solved an immediate problem and created an enduring one. A living deposed Tsar would have been a permanent invitation to conspiracy, a figurehead for every discontented nobleman and foreign power with ambitions in Russia. A dead one became a question she could never entirely escape. Catherine had secured her throne, but the ground beneath it and the nature of the power she now held would demand everything she had. The question now was what kind of ruler she intended to be. With the throne secured and her enemies silenced, Catherine turned to the question that had animated her since girlhood. She had read voraciously in those early years at the Russian court, filling the long hours of a loveless marriage with books that most empresses would never have touched. Now at last, she had the power to act on what she had learned. The letters began almost immediately after her coronation. To Voltaire, the aged lion of European philosophy living in self-imposed exile at his estate in Ferney, Catherine wrote with a combination of flattery and genuine intellectual engagement that disarmed him completely. She praised his campaigns against religious fanaticism. She positioned Russia as a nation ready to embrace reason. Voltaire, who had spent decades prodding the crowned heads of Europe toward rationality with limited success, found in Catherine something he had scarcely believed possible, an empress who seemed to actually mean it. He called her the North Star. He declared that if the philosophies of Paris could not reform France, perhaps Enlightenment would travel east instead. The correspondence that followed, stretching over more than a decade and running to hundreds of letters, became one of the great intellectual exchanges of the century. Catherine was performing, certainly. She understood the value of Voltaire's approval in shaping how educated Europe perceived her rule. But the performance was built on a real foundation. She genuinely grappled with the ideas. Denis Diderot, the brilliant and perpetually struggling editor of the Encyclopédie, presented a different kind of opportunity. When the French government threatened to suppress his great project, Catherine offered to purchase his library outright and leave it in his possession until he died. It was an act of breathtaking generosity, and it bound Diderot to her cause as firmly as any contract. He would not actually make the journey to St. Petersburg until 1773, a visit that would prove both charming and illuminating. But the relationship Catherine cultivated with him through years of letters established her credentials among the philosophies beyond dispute. The patronage was not merely personal. Catherine began acquiring art on a scale that astonished even the most acquisitive European courts. Starting in 1764, she purchased a collection of over 225 Dutch and Flemish paintings that had been assembled for Frederick of Prussia, who ultimately could not afford them. They arrived in St. Petersburg and were installed in a building beside the Winter Palace designed specifically to house them, a structure the Empress called her Hermitage, her place of retreat. The collection would grow over the decades into one of the greatest assemblages of art in human history. Educational and medical reforms followed with similar energy. Catherine established new schools for girls, founded institutions for the training of midwives, and imported European expertise to modernize Russian medicine. Then, in 1768, she took an action that was both a public health measure and a masterpiece of political theater. Smallpox was devastating Russia. The Empress invited a British physician named Thomas Dimsdale to inoculate her, accepting the procedure in full view of the court at a time when inoculation remained deeply controversial and many considered it more dangerous than the disease itself. It was an act of calculated courage. Catherine understood that if she hesitated, her court would hesitate. By submitting herself first, she removed the argument. Inoculations spread rapidly through the Russian nobility in the months that followed. Yet beneath all this genuine reform ran a current of contradiction that the philosophies in their comfortable studies never fully acknowledged. Russia was not France. Enlightenment principles required something that Catherine could not ultimately provide without dismantling the very foundations of her own authority. The serfs who worked the estates of her nobles lived in conditions that bore no resemblance to the rational, humane society her letters described. She knew this. She felt the tension. And as the 1760s came to a close, she attempted to address it through her most ambitious project yet, a sweeping new legal code built on Enlightenment principles that she called the nakaz. Whether that grand vision would survive its collision with Russian reality was a question the coming years would answer with brutal clarity. The nakaz was unlike anything a ruling monarch had ever produced. For nearly 2 years, Catherine worked on it in the quiet hours before dawn, rising early while her court still slept, filling notebook after notebook with her careful handwriting. She drew heavily from Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws and the Italian jurist Cesare Beccaria's landmark work on crime and punishment, synthesizing their arguments into a document she intended as nothing less than the philosophical foundation for a new Russia. When she finished, the nakaz ran to over 500 articles. It called for equality before the law, argued against torture, questioned the necessity of the death penalty, and affirmed the principle that citizens should not be presumed guilty before conviction. She showed early drafts to her advisors. Their alarm was immediate. Several passages touching on serfdom were quietly removed before publication. Even Catherine's vision had limits imposed by political reality, and she understood that a document which threatened the nobility's control over their serfs would never survive the translation from paper to practice. Still, what remained was extraordinary. No Russian ruler had ever committed to such principles in writing. The document was translated into more than a dozen languages and read with fascination across Europe. In the summer of 1767, the delegates arrived in Moscow, 564 of them drawn from the nobility, the towns, the state peasantry, and various non-Russian peoples of the empire, each carrying a written statement of grievances from their community. It was, in its rough outline, something resembling a representative assembly, the closest Russia had ever come to a deliberate gathering of its own people to discuss governance. The debates that followed were illuminating and, for Catherine, increasingly uncomfortable. Delegates from the nobility pushed back hard against any suggestion of limiting their power over serfs. When the question of serfdom arose directly, noble representatives argued not for its reform, but for its expansion. Some demanded that the state peasantry be brought under private noble control as well. The gulf between the nakaz's elegant principles and the assembled delegates' actual priorities could not have been more apparent. Religious tolerance proved equally contentious. Russia was a vast empire containing Orthodox Christians, Muslims, Catholics, Lutherans, and dozens of other faiths. Proposals for greater tolerance alarmed the Orthodox clergy and their supporters. The death penalty debates produced more heat than resolution. After more than 200 sessions spread over more than a year, the commission had produced considerable argument but no new legal code. Then, in December of 1768, Catherine dissolved it. War with the Ottoman Empire had just begun, providing a convenient official reason for suspension. The commission never reconvened. Had it failed? In the narrowest sense, yes. No new laws emerged. The contradictions of Russian society had simply proven too deep, the interests too entrenched, for a legislative body to bridge them through debate. But Catherine drew her own conclusions with characteristic pragmatism. She had learned something invaluable about the nature of her empire and the people who held power within it. Grand philosophical architectures would not reshape Russia from above. Change, where it came, would have to be incremental, negotiated, and sometimes abandoned entirely when it threatened the foundations of noble support on which her throne ultimately rested. The enlightened empress would not disappear. Catherine would continue corresponding with Voltaire, continue acquiring art, continue presenting herself to Europe as reason's champion in the frozen north. But the Legislative Commission had taught her something the philosophies never quite grasped from their studies in Paris. Governing an empire was not writing a book. The lesson would be tested almost immediately. Within a few years, a crisis was gathering in the eastern provinces that would shake her reign to its foundations and force her to confront the human cost of the very contradictions she had failed to resolve. The ink on the Legislative Commission's dissolution papers was barely dry when the Ottoman Sultan Mustafa III made a decision that would reshape the map of Europe. In October of 1768, Constantinople declared war on Russia. The stated grievance was Russian interference in Poland, where Catherine's forces had pursued rebel confederates across the Ottoman border. But the deeper truth was older and simpler. Two empires were competing for the same territory, and one of them had been growing stronger every decade. Few in Europe expected what happened next. Catherine had inherited an army with real strengths and a navy in questionable condition. The Black Sea was effectively an Ottoman lake. Russia had no fleet there worth speaking of, and the Turks had controlled those warm southern waters for centuries. What Catherine possessed was something harder to quantify: organizational will, talented commanders, and an absolute refusal to accept the limits others imagined for her empire. On the ground, General Pyotr Rumyantsev proved her confidence well-founded. In the summer of 1770, his forces met a vastly larger Ottoman army at the Larga River. Rumyantsev refused the defensive posture his outnumbered position seemed to demand. He attacked. The Ottomans broke. Weeks later at Kagul, he did it again, driving an army that outnumbered his own by perhaps 10-1 into a full retreat. These were not minor skirmishes. They announced that Russian arms, properly led, could defeat the most powerful military force in the Islamic world. But it was at sea where the world truly took notice. Catherine had made a bold and improbable decision. She sent a Russian naval squadron from the Baltic all the way around the European continent, through the Strait of Gibraltar, and into the Mediterranean. The voyage itself was an achievement. When that fleet, under Admiral Alexei Orlov, encountered the Ottoman Navy in the waters off the Aegean coast in July of 1770, the result was catastrophic for the Turks. The two fleets met first at Chios, and the following night, in the harbor of Chesma, Russian fireships bore down on the anchored Ottoman vessels in darkness. The harbor became an inferno. Nearly the entire Ottoman fleet burned. Observers said the sky glowed orange for miles. Perhaps 11,000 Ottoman sailors died in a single night. The Battle of Chesma sent a message that echoed through every European court. Russia was no longer simply a land power. Catherine had projected force into waters her predecessors had never dreamed of reaching. 4 years of grinding warfare followed, with Russia consolidating its gains while the Ottomans struggled to recover. In July of 1774, the two empires signed the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca. The terms represented a transformation of the entire regional order. Russia gained territory on the northern Black Sea coast. The Crimean Khanate, long an Ottoman dependency, was declared independent, which everyone understood as a prelude to eventual Russian absorption. Russian merchant ships gained the right to navigate the Black Sea and pass through the straits into the Mediterranean. And in a clause whose consequences would ripple across the next 2 centuries, Russia was recognized as the protector of Orthodox Christian subjects within the Ottoman Empire. It was a foot in the door of Ottoman internal affairs, and Catherine had no intention of removing it. She was 35 when the war began. She was 45 when she signed the peace. The woman who had arrived in Russia as an obscure German princess had just humbled one of the world's great empires and redrawn the boundaries of a continent. The victories, however, had not come without cost elsewhere. While Catherine's armies marched south toward glory, something far darker was unraveling in the east, where a man named Pugachev was about to turn Russia's forgotten millions into a force that threatened everything she had built. Poland, in the middle of the 18th century, was a kingdom in name and a fiction in practice. Its parliament, the Sejm, operated under a rule called the liberum veto, which allowed any single nobleman to dissolve the entire legislative session and void every measure it had passed. The result was a country constitutionally incapable of governing itself, surrounded by neighbors who found that incapacity enormously convenient. Catherine found it most convenient of all. When the Polish king Augustus III died in October of 1763, a throne became available. Catherine had a candidate in mind. His name was Stanisław Poniatowski, a polished, French-educated Polish nobleman who had spent time at the Russian court and captured Catherine's attention years before she became empress. He was charming, cultured, and crucially, not the kind of man who would forget who had placed the crown on his head. Russian troops were already stationed near the Polish border when the election was held in September of 1764. The vote of the Polish nobility was unanimous. Poniatowski was now King Stanisław Augustus. The unanimity owed less to his considerable personal qualities than to the soldiers visible on the horizon. What followed was a study in imperial manipulation. Catherine positioned herself as Poland's protector, guaranteeing the rights of its Orthodox and Protestant minorities while quietly ensuring that no reform could strengthen the Polish state against Russian interests. When Polish nobles organized themselves into the Confederation of Bar in 1768 to resist both Russian interference and their own king, Catherine sent in the troops. The rebellion dragged on for 4 brutal years before collapsing. But the chaos attracted attention. Prussia's Frederick the Great and Austria's Maria Theresa watched a destabilized Poland with their own ambitions. Frederick, always the pragmatist, proposed an elegant solution to the competing pressures. Why fight over Poland? Why not simply divide it? Catherine had reservations. Poland was more useful as a dependent buffer state than as a partitioned corpse. But the alternative, a war with Prussia and Austria over territory she was already struggling to control, was less appealing. Negotiations proceeded through 1771 and into 1772. In August of that year, the 3 powers signed the first partition of Poland. Russia claimed the largest share by area, absorbing territories in the east. Prussia took a strategically vital strip connecting its separated territories. Austria seized the fertile southern region of Galicia. Poland lost roughly 30% of its territory and perhaps a third of its population, all without a single battle fought against the partitioning powers. The moral stain was not lost on Europe's observers. Voltaire, who had praised Catherine so lavishly, fell conspicuously silent on the matter. Even Maria Theresa, who accepted her share of the spoils, reportedly wept while signing the documents. Frederick II, characteristically, joked that she wept but kept taking. Catherine had proven that she could dominate a neighbor without destroying it entirely. The question was whether Stanisław Augustus would ever truly rule the kingdom she had given him. While Catherine's diplomats were still congratulating themselves over the maps of partitioned Poland, something was stirring on the remote steppes east of the Volga River. It would prove far more dangerous than any foreign treaty. His name was Yemlian Pugachev, a Cossack from the Yaik River region, a soldier with a weathered face, a commanding presence, and a story that would shake an empire. In the autumn of 1773, he began telling that story to anyone who would listen. He was not, he claimed, a runaway deserter. He was Peter III, Catherine's murdered husband, miraculously alive and returned to reclaim his throne. The claim was preposterous, and it spread like wildfire. To understand why, one must understand who was listening. The Cossacks of the Yaik had seen their ancient freedoms steadily crushed under imperial administration. The serfs laboring on noble estates lived in conditions barely distinguishable from slavery. The Bashkirs, Tatars, and other minority peoples of the region had watched Russian colonization swallow their lands for generations. All of them had grievances. All of them needed a symbol. Pugachev gave them one. By early 1774, his force had grown from a few hundred followers to tens of thousands. He issued proclamations in the name of Peter III, promising serfs their freedom, promising Cossacks their old privileges, promising the Bashkirs their lands. The rebel army swept across a vast swath of the empire's southeastern frontier, and in its wake came slaughter. Nobles were hanged from their own gateposts. Officials were massacred. Entire estates burned against the winter sky. The siege of Orenburg, a major administrative center, lasted 6 months. Catherine's government was slow to grasp the scale of what was happening. When the reports finally reached St. Petersburg, the alarm was genuine. This was not a localized riot. This was a revolution threatening the empire's social foundation. Catherine dispatched military forces, but the terrain was vast and Pugachev elusive. He suffered defeats, rebuilt his army, and pushed onward. By the summer of 1774, his forces were approaching the Volga and threatening the city of Kazan, which they briefly captured and burned in July. For a moment, the unthinkable seemed possible. That moment passed. The empire's professional armies eventually brought their full weight to bear, and the tide turned decisively. The officer who would later become Russia's greatest military genius, Alexander Suvorov, was among those tasked with running Pugachev down. Pursued relentlessly, his army shattered and his support dissolving, Pugachev was finally betrayed by his own Cossack lieutenants in September of 1774. They handed him over in chains, perhaps hoping to buy mercy for themselves. He was transported to Moscow in an iron cage. In January of 1775, after a public trial that served as much as a spectacle of imperial authority as a legal proceeding, Pugachev was executed in Bolotnaya Square before a large crowd. He was beheaded and quartered, his body parts displayed as a warning. Catherine was shaken in ways she could not easily admit. The rebellion had exposed a terrifying truth beneath her enlightened rhetoric. The millions of serfs upon whose labor the entire Russian noble class depended were not grateful subjects lifted by benevolent governance. They were a powder keg. Every sophisticated conversation about Voltaire, every letter to Diderot, every carefully drafted legal code existed in a country where human beings were bought and sold with the land they worked. After Pugachev, Catherine moved not toward emancipation but away from it. Noble authority over serfs was quietly strengthened. The Yaik Cossacks were renamed, their old identity erased by imperial decree. The river itself was renamed the Ural, as if changing a name could bury a memory. It could not. The memory would survive, passed in whispers across the steppe for generations, a reminder that empires built on inequality carry their own destruction quietly within them. The rebellion was over, but Catherine's reckoning with it had only just begun, and it would reshape the final decades of. The execution in Bolotnaya Square had barely faded from memory when Catherine set her ministers to work. She had seen what happened when an empire's foundations cracked, and she intended to shore them up with something more durable than fear. The instrument she chose was law. In 1775, she issued the Statute for the Administration of the Provinces, one of the most ambitious restructuring efforts in Russian history. The old patchwork of regional administration, inherited from Peter the Great and never properly rationalized, was swept aside. In its place, Catherine imposed a new order. Russia would now be divided into 50 governorates, each containing roughly 300,000 to 400,000 souls, each governed by a royally appointed official answerable directly to the crown. Below these governorates, districts provided a second tier of administration. The architecture was clean, rational, and deliberately difficult for any future Pugachev to exploit. What made the system work, at least in theory, was the role Catherine carved out for the nobility. Elected noble assemblies would handle local judicial and administrative functions. The nobles themselves would serve as justices, assessors, and officers of the district courts. Catherine was, in effect, recruiting Russia's landowning class into the machinery of government, giving them a stake in the stability of the system they had once merely benefited from. It was shrewd statecraft. A nobleman with an official role and a salary had reasons to suppress disorder, not simply flee from it. Then, in 1785, Catherine went further. The charter to the nobility formalized and expanded what had been growing informally for decades. Russian nobles were now formally exempt from compulsory state service, from personal taxation, from corporal punishment. Their estates were declared their unambiguous property. Their right to organize provincial noble assemblies was enshrined in law. For the first time, Russian aristocrats possessed something approaching the legal standing of their Western European counterparts. The same year brought the charter to the towns, an attempt to cultivate a more robust urban middle class. Town dwellers were sorted into categories based on wealth and occupation, and each category was granted specific rights of self-governance. Merchant guilds, craftsmen's associations, and elected town councils were all given formal recognition. But here lay the great paradox at the heart of Catherine's reforms, the contradiction she could never quite resolve. The same decade that granted nobles magnificent new freedoms also tightened the chains on the serfs those nobles owned. Noble power over the peasants working their estates was strengthened rather than questioned. Catherine knew the arithmetic of her empire. The nobility was her bedrock. Displease them and the regime itself might crumble, as it had crumbled for Peter III. But empowering nobles meant entrenching the serf system that made their power possible. She had written, years earlier, of the importance of human dignity and rational law. She had corresponded with the greatest minds of the Enlightenment about liberty and governance. None of those letters altered the fundamental reality. Millions of Russian serfs were, after 1785, more thoroughly under noble authority than they had been before. Their labor, their bodies, and their fates bound to estates that had just received elegant legal protections. Catherine had built a more efficient empire. She had not built a more just one. The reforms endured. The 50 governorates would survive, largely intact, well into the 19th century. The noble assemblies would become fixtures of Russian provincial life. Catherine had transformed the administrative geography of the largest country on earth. What she could not transform was the social fault line running beneath all of it. That unresolved tension would define Russia's next century and haunt every reformer who followed her. But for now, with her empire reorganized and her nobility satisfied, Catherine turned her restless ambition outward once more, toward the south, toward the Black Sea, and toward a rivalry with the Ottoman Empire that she intended to win. Before the reforms, before the reorganization, before the careful legal architecture Catherine had spent a decade constructing, there was Potemkin. Grigory Alexandrovich Potemkin entered Catherine's life fully in 1774, at a moment when the empire was still raw from the Pugachev rebellion. He was 35 years old, physically enormous, one-eyed from an old quarrel, possessed of a volcanic intelligence and a charm that contemporaries struggled to describe without reaching for superlatives. Catherine was 45. She had known many favorites. She had never known anyone quite like this. What began as passion became something far more difficult to categorize. Within months of their affair beginning, the evidence suggests something remarkable happened. Letters survive in which Catherine addresses Potemkin as her husband. He addresses her as his wife. Historians have debated the question for generations. But the weight of scholarship now leans toward a conclusion that would have been explosive had it ever become public. Sometime in the winter of 1774 or 1775, Catherine the Great and Grigory Potemkin were almost certainly secretly married. If true, it never became official. It never could. The political consequences would have been catastrophic. But the intimacy it represented shaped everything that followed. Because what came next was not simply a love affair running its course. It was a partnership without parallel in Russian history. When their romantic involvement eventually cooled, around 1776, something stronger replaced it. Potemkin became, in practical terms, co-ruler of the empire. His titles accumulated like sediment: Prince of the Holy Roman Empire, Governor General of New Russia, Commander of the Southern Armies. He administered vast territories, commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and negotiated with foreign powers on Catherine's behalf. He founded cities: Kherson, Ekaterinoslav, Sevastopol. Settlements that exist to this day were Potemkin's creation. He organized the annexation of Crimea in 1783, adding an entire peninsula to the empire without a single major battle. When Catherine traveled south in 1787 on her famous tour, it was Potemkin who had transformed the landscape she passed through, building a new civilization along the Black Sea coast with staggering speed. The legend of his so-called Potemkin villages, false facades erected to impress the empress, almost certainly exaggerates the deception and underestimates the genuine achievement. The towns were real. The fleet in Sevastopol harbor was real. Potemkin had simply bent reality closer to his ambitions than anyone thought possible. And through all of it, Catherine took other favorites, younger men, handsome and entertaining, who occupied the role Potemkin no longer filled romantically. But here lay the remarkable arrangement at the heart of their relationship. Potemkin approved them. Sometimes he selected them. He remained the indispensable man regardless of who shared the empress's bed, because no one else possessed his combination of military genius, administrative ruthlessness, and total psychological understanding of Catherine herself. They argued ferociously, reconciled tenderly, and trusted each other in ways neither trusted anyone else. Their correspondence, running to hundreds of letters, is by turns politically acute and achingly intimate. When Potemkin died in 1791, collapsing on a road in Moldavia at the age of 52, Catherine wept for days. She told her secretary she had no one left to rely on. She was not wrong. The man who had helped her reshape the Southern Empire, who had been her partner and perhaps her husband, was gone. The question now was whether the empire he helped build could hold against the pressures gathering at its borders, and whether Catherine at 62 still had the strength to answer them. The prize had been in Russian sights for decades. The Crimean Peninsula jutted into the Black Sea like a clenched fist, controlling access to warm water ports, Mediterranean trade routes, and the soft underbelly of Ottoman power. For Catherine, it represented something beyond mere geography. It represented destiny. Potemkin had given the ambition a name, the Greek project, as he and Catherine called it in their private correspondence, imagined something breathtaking in its audacity. The Ottomans would be driven from Europe entirely. A restored Byzantine empire would rise from their ruins, governed by Catherine's own grandson, whom she had pointedly named Constantine at birth. Constantinople itself would fall under Russian influence. It was a dream that exceeded anything even Peter the Great had contemplated. But dreams required foundations, and the foundation for everything was Crimea. The groundwork had been laid quietly, methodically, over nearly a decade. The Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca in 1774 had technically made the Crimean Khanate independent from Ottoman control, which in practice meant vulnerable to Russian pressure instead. Catherine and Potemkin exploited every fracture within Crimean politics, supporting client Khans, stoking factional violence, and positioning Russian troops along the borders as patient reminders of where real power resided. By 1783, the manipulation had done its work. The last Khan, Shahin Gurey, was a Russian-backed figure so isolated from his own people that he could barely govern. In April of that year, he abdicated under pressure, and Catherine issued her manifesto formally annexing the Crimean Khanate into the Russian Empire. There was no major battle. No dramatic military campaign. An entire sovereign territory dissolved into the empire through diplomatic suffocation, and the Ottoman Sultan, exhausted and overextended, could do nothing but swallow the humiliation. The speed of what followed was staggering. Potemkin understood that possession meant nothing without presence. Within months of annexation, construction began on what would become Sevastopol, a name meaning venerable city in Greek, a deliberate choice signaling the empire's classical ambitions. The harbor was nearly perfect, a deep natural anchorage that could shelter an entire battle fleet. Potemkin threw resources at it with characteristic recklessness and characteristic results. Where there had been fishing villages, a naval fortress rose from the limestone cliffs. Where Ottoman galleys had once patrolled, Russian warships now drilled in formation. The Black Sea Fleet became Potemkin's obsession and his monument. Within 4 years of annexation, it comprised dozens of vessels capable of projecting Russian power across waters that had once been an Ottoman lake. The strategic transformation was complete. Russia had become a Black Sea power. Catherine wanted to see it for herself. In January of 1787, she departed St. Petersburg for the most elaborate royal journey in Russian history. The procession stretched for miles, 14 carriages and hundreds of courtiers moving through the winter landscape toward the south. Foreign ambassadors traveled alongside her. The Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, traveling incognito as Count Falkenstein, joined her at Kherson. Together they sailed down the Dnieper toward Crimea. Here the legend took root. Critics, many of them foreign diplomats with reasons to diminish Russian achievement, whispered that Potemkin had constructed elaborate false fronts, painted villages with cheerful facades that concealed emptiness behind them. The phrase Potemkin village entered European vocabulary as a synonym for hollow spectacle. The truth was considerably more complicated and considerably more impressive. Yes, Potemkin choreographed the journey carefully. Yes, settlements appeared at their most favorable angle, but the fleet anchored at Sevastopol harbor was no illusion. The cities of Kherson and Ekaterinoslav were not painted canvas. An empire had genuinely been planted in what had been steppe and salt marsh within a single decade. Catherine stood on the deck of her galley and watched her Black Sea warships pass in review. Whatever she felt in that moment, satisfaction, vindication, wonder, she kept largely private. What she could not keep private was what came next. The Ottomans, watching the triumphant procession with gathering fury, had seen enough. By the summer of 1787, Ottoman patience had expired. The sight of Catherine parading through freshly conquered Crimea, accompanied by a Holy Roman Emperor, reviewing a battle fleet that had no right to exist in waters they once owned, was more than Constantinople could absorb. In August of that year, the Ottoman Empire declared war on Russia. They intended to take back everything they had lost. It would be the costliest miscalculation of the century. The opening campaign fell to Potemkin, and the first great objective was Ochakov, a massive Ottoman fortress guarding the estuary where the Dnieper and Bug rivers emptied into the Black Sea. Without Ochakov, Russian control of the coast remained fragile, but taking it proved brutally slow. Potemkin laid siege in the summer of 1788, and for months the armies endured each other across frozen ground. the Russian troops suffering terribly in conditions that killed thousands before a single assault was ordered. Then, on the 17th of December, 1788, Potemkin finally unleashed his forces. The storming lasted less than 2 hours. It killed perhaps 10,000 Ottoman defenders and an unknown number of Russian attackers. The carnage was appalling even by the standards of an age accustomed to appalling things. When Potemkin entered the ruins, the fortress had been effectively destroyed along with its garrison. The estuary was Russian, but the cost lived in the faces of the men who had fought there. Yet it was at Izmail, 2 years later, that the war produced its most legendary moment. Izmail was considered impregnable, a fortress of earthworks and stone on the Danube, garrisoned by 35,000 men, defended by 265 artillery pieces. 3 previous Russian commanders had studied its walls and declined the attempt. Alexander Suvorov did not decline. In December of 1790, Suvorov arrived before Izmail and spent 8 days building a replica of the fortress walls from earthworks, drilling his troops in the precise movements of an assault they had never attempted against walls they had never seen. On the 22nd of December, before dawn, he sent 30,000 soldiers at the fortifications from multiple directions simultaneously. The fighting inside the walls lasted most of the day, hand to hand in the streets and buildings, savage and close. By evening, Izmail had fallen. Nearly all of its defenders were dead. Suvorov reported his own casualties with characteristic bluntness. He had spent lives to purchase a fortress that changed the entire shape of the war. Catherine received the news in St. Petersburg with calculated celebration. She understood what Suvorov had done. The Ottomans had no answer for it. Peace came in January of 1792 with the Treaty of Jassy. Russia retained everything. Crimea confirmed beyond any further dispute. The northern Black Sea coast secured from the Dniester to the Bug. The Ottomans acknowledged a boundary that would define the region for generations. What Catherine had built with patient diplomacy and annexation in 1783 had now been sealed in blood and treaty language. But the victory arrived wrapped in personal loss. In October of 1791, Grigory Potemkin died on a roadside in Moldavia, collapsing during a journey worn through by decades of impossible exertion. He was 52 years old. Catherine wept openly when the news reached her, something she permitted herself almost never. She had lost a partner whose like she would not find again, the man who had taken her ambitions seriously enough to make them real. The empire he helped build remained. The woman who had imagined it continued to rule. But something irreplaceable had gone out of the reign, and those closest to Catherine knew it. To the west, however, a different kind of crisis had been gathering for years, one that threatened the very idea of monarchy itself. While Catherine absorbed the loss of Potemkin and consolidated her southern gains, something extraordinary was happening in Warsaw. On the 3rd of May, 1791, the Polish Parliament adopted a new constitution, the first of its kind in Europe, and only the second written national constitution in the world, following the American example by just 4 years. It guaranteed civil rights, reformed the government, abolished the infamous liberum veto that had paralyzed Polish politics for generations, and created a genuinely modern state. To most of Europe, it was an inspiring achievement. To Catherine, it was a catastrophe. A reformed, stable Poland was precisely what she could not permit. A weak Poland, chronically incapable of governing itself, served Russian interests perfectly. A strong Poland, organized on enlightened principles, sitting directly on Russia's western frontier, was an entirely different proposition. And in the revolutionary atmosphere of 1791, with France already burning, the spectacle of constitutional reform spreading eastward filled Catherine with something approaching genuine dread. She moved quickly and without mercy. In May of 1792, Russian armies crossed into Poland on the pretext of restoring the old order. Invited by a small group of Polish nobles who had sold their country's future for Russian promises, the Polish military resisted heroically but hopelessly, outnumbered and outmaneuvered. By the summer, the Constitution was dead. In January of 1793, Russia and Prussia formalized the Second Partition, carving away vast territories. Poland lost nearly half of what remained of its territory and perhaps 4 million of its people. But the Poles were not finished. In March of 1794, a soldier named Tadeusz Kościuszko raised the standard of insurrection in Krakow, a veteran of the American Revolution, a man who had fought alongside Washington and understood what it meant to resist an empire. Kościuszko rallied a desperate national uprising. At the Battle of Rakowicz in April, his forces, including peasants armed with nothing but scythes, routed a Russian detachment and briefly electrified Europe. Catherine summoned Suvorov. The same general who had taken Izmail now turned his systematic brutality westward. By the autumn of 1794, the uprising was crushed, Warsaw occupied, Kościuszko wounded and captured. Suvorov's forces killed thousands in the Warsaw suburb of Praga, a massacre so savage it extinguished whatever resistance remained. What followed was simply erasure. In October of 1795, Russia, Prussia, and Austria signed the Third Partition. Poland ceased to exist as a political entity, wiped from the maps of Europe entirely. A nation of millions with a history stretching back 8 centuries vanished between the signatures of 3 monarchs. Catherine received the largest share. She did not live to see the full weight of what she had done, but history would not forget it. Poland would not reemerge as an independent state for 123 years, and the wound left behind would shape European politics long after Catherine herself was gone. The fires consuming France in 1789 seemed at first almost satisfying to Catherine. The Bourbon monarchy she had long considered decadent and weak was finally facing consequences. She watched from St. Petersburg with the detachment of a woman who believed she understood power better than any king in Versailles. That detachment did not last. As the revolution devoured its own, as Louis XVI was stripped of his throne and then his head in January of 1793, Catherine's initial contempt curdled into something far more personal. This was not merely a French problem. It was a contagion, and her own empire shared a border with ideas that traveled faster than armies. The woman who had once corresponded warmly with Voltaire, who had invited philosophies to her table and filled her library with the great texts of the Enlightenment, now saw those same ideas as weapons pointed at her throne. The contradiction was complete, and Catherine knew it. She simply did not care. The crackdown came swiftly and without sentiment. In 1790, a nobleman and writer named Alexander Radishchev published his Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow, a book structured as an innocent travelogue, but seething with condemnation of serfdom, autocracy, and the vast human suffering Catherine's empire rested upon. It was precisely the kind of moral critique the younger Catherine had invited and encouraged. The older Catherine had Radishchev arrested within weeks of publication. He was sentenced to death, a sentence she commuted to 10 years of Siberian exile, though contemporaries noted the commutation was not especially merciful given the conditions awaiting him there. The publisher Nikolai Novikov suffered a different fate. One of Russia's most important intellectual voices, a Freemason with extensive connections to European reform movements, Novikov was imprisoned in the Schlüsselburg fortress in 1792 without trial. He would remain there for 4 years. Catherine simultaneously moved against Freemasonry across the empire, viewing its networks of educated men exchanging progressive ideas as precisely the kind of invisible conspiracy that had undermined the French crown. New censorship laws tightened around Russian publishing. Books were scrutinized, salons watched, correspondence monitored. The intellectual culture Catherine had spent decades cultivating began to wither under her own hand. How does a ruler reconcile that? How does the woman who once declared that the purpose of law was to protect liberty become the woman signing orders to silence the writers who believed her? The answer, perhaps, is that Catherine had never been a true believer in Enlightenment principles so much as a sophisticated user of them. They had served her image, her diplomacy, her self-conception as Europe's most civilized monarch. When they threatened her power, they became expendable. She would not have long to live with the choice. By 1796, Catherine the Great was 67 years old, increasingly infirm, and the empire she had shaped so forcefully for 34 years was about to pass into very different hands. Before the crackdowns, before the fear crept into her correspondence, Catherine the Great had spent 3 decades doing something no Russian ruler before her had attempted with such ferocity: building. Not merely in the military sense, though the conquests were vast. Building in brick and marble and canvas. Building in language, in music, in the architecture of human thought. When Catherine arrived in St. Petersburg in 1745 as a minor German princess, Russia's cultural institutions were thin, borrowed things, pale imitations of French and German models. When she died, the country possessed some of the greatest collections, academies, and cities in the world. The Hermitage stands as perhaps her most visible monument. What began in 1764 as a private gallery for her own pleasure grew into something staggering. By the end of her reign, Catherine had acquired more than 4,000 paintings, including entire collections purchased wholesale from European nobility facing debt or revolution. Rembrandt, Raphael, Van Dyck, works by the hundreds arriving in crates at the Winter Palace. She called her collection a hermitage, a retreat, a place of solitude. She was being modest, and she knew it. Beyond St. Petersburg, she built cities from almost nothing. Kherson rose from the southern steppe in 1778 as a naval base and gateway to the Black Sea. Yekaterinoslav, meaning glory of Catherine, followed as an ambitious vision of classical urban planning on the Dnieper. And Odessa, founded in 1794, would grow into one of the great cosmopolitan ports of Europe, a city of traders, languages, and cultures that still pulses with her ambition today. She imported architects from across Europe, most notably the Scottish-Italian designer Charles Cameron and the Italian Carlo Rossi, commissioning palaces and gardens that blended classical European grandeur with the Russian landscape's particular severity. She wrote detailed instructions, argued over proportions, and changed her mind constantly. Her architects learned to expect revisions. Catherine also turned her attention to the life of the mind in more institutional ways. The Russian Academy, founded in 1783 under the direction of Princess Yekaterina Dashkova, dedicated itself to the Russian language itself, producing the first comprehensive dictionary of Russian. Dashkova also oversaw educational expansion for women, a genuinely radical act in a century that largely regarded female intellect as decorative at best. And Catherine herself wrote plays performed at the Hermitage Theater, memoirs of startling candor, never intended for publication in her lifetime. Thousands of letters to Voltaire, to Grimm, to Potemkin, letters that ranged from statecraft to gossip to genuine philosophical inquiry. She wrote, by most estimates, more than 19,000 letters across her lifetime. The contradiction that would consume her final years was always present in that output. The woman writing so brilliantly about liberty was the same woman who would eventually silence those who agreed with her too loudly. But the buildings remained. The collections remained. And Russia, for all its coming turbulence, would face the 19th century as something Catherine had willed it to become, a civilization the world could no longer ignore. The contradiction at the heart of Catherine's reign had a name, and that name was serfdom. She knew it. In her private correspondence, She admitted what she could never say from the throne. Writing to one confidant, she described the condition of Russian serfs with blunt moral clarity, acknowledging that a human being owned by another human being was an arrangement that offended reason itself. She was fluent in the language of Enlightenment. She understood the argument, and then she did almost nothing to end it. More than that, she made it worse. When Catherine seized power in 1762, roughly half of Russia's population lived in bondage. Serfs could not leave their land, could not marry without permission, could not petition the government without their master's approval. They were bought and sold alongside the estates they worked. They were, in every meaningful sense, property. Catherine extended this system deliberately and systematically. As Russia absorbed Ukraine and the newly conquered southern territories, she brought serfdom with her, binding populations that had previously known greater freedoms under Polish or Ottoman administration. Millions of people who had never been serfs became serfs because the empire had arrived on their doorstep. She went further still. Laws passed under her reign explicitly forbade serfs from petitioning the empress directly. Any serf who attempted to bring a grievance to Catherine personally faced punishment for the act itself, regardless of whether the grievance was legitimate. The message was unambiguous. The distance between ruler and the ruled was not to be bridged. And in the currency of patronage that Catherine used so expertly to maintain loyalty among her nobles, serfs became gifts. Favorites received thousands of souls, the official term used in Russian accounting, as rewards for service or affection. Potemkin received tens of thousands. Gregory Orlov received thousands more. Human beings distributed like parcels. Why? Partly because Catherine understood that her power rested on the nobility, and the nobility's wealth rested on serf labor. Any serious challenge to serfdom would have been political suicide, and Catherine had not survived this long by being naive. Partly because reform at that scale required administrative machinery Russia simply did not possess. And partly, historians have argued, because it was easier to write about justice than to enact it. The consequences would not arrive on her watch. They would arrive in 1861. When Alexander II finally abolished serfdom after decades of pressure, rebellion, and moral reckoning. By then, Russia would carry nearly a century of accumulated grievance, a vast population whose bondage had deepened precisely during the reign of the ruler who most admired human freedom. The great question of Catherine's legacy was never really about the paintings or the palaces or the cities on the steppe. It was always about this, about the millions who built the empire and owned none of it. And it would be that question, not her letters to Voltaire, that defined the century to come. By the final years of her reign, Catherine the Great was 63 years old, and the empire she had built across more than 3 decades of relentless work showed no signs of releasing her from its demands. She rose before dawn. She lit her own fire, made her own coffee, and was seated at her desk before her servants were fully awake. The routine had barely changed in 30 years. State papers, correspondence, meetings with ministers, the endless machinery of governing 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. She had built this habit when she was young and ambitious. She maintained it now simply because she did not know how to stop. But something darker had settled over the court at St. Petersburg. The question of succession had become a wound that would not close. Her son Paul had waited his entire life for a throne his mother refused to surrender. The relationship between them had curdled long ago, shaped by decades of mutual suspicion and Catherine's barely concealed contempt for a man she considered temperamentally unfit to rule. Paul was erratic, obsessive, prone to fits of rage. Catherine knew it. Her court knew it, and Catherine had begun to consider the unthinkable. Her grandson Alexander, Paul's eldest son, was everything Paul was not. Tall, charming, educated under Catherine's own supervision according to Enlightenment principles she had carefully selected. She had even drafted documents exploring the possibility of bypassing Paul entirely and naming Alexander her direct successor. The papers were written. The plan was considered, but she never signed the final decree, and the hesitation would cost Russia dearly. Into this atmosphere of dynastic anxiety stepped Platon Zubov, the last of Catherine's famous favorites. He was 22 when he entered her court in 1789, more than 40 years her junior. His influence over the aging empress alarmed her senior ministers and drew whispered ridicule from foreign observers. But Catherine, who had always understood the architecture of her own loneliness, kept him close until the end. November 1796 arrived cold and ordinary. On the morning of the 16th, Catherine completed her correspondence, received visitors, and retired for the evening in apparent good health. The following morning, her attendants found her collapsed on the floor of her dressing room. She had suffered a massive stroke. She never regained consciousness. On November the 17th, 1796, Catherine the Great died at the age of 67. The woman who had ruled the most powerful empire on earth for 34 years left without a farewell, without a final proclamation, without the grand theatrical exit history might have expected. Paul, the son she had never trusted, was emperor before the day was out. The throne she had refused to relinquish for 3 decades changed hands in a matter of hours, and with it, everything she had built would face a reckoning she had spent her final years trying to prevent. What does it mean to be great? The question has haunted historians for centuries, and few figures demand its asking more urgently than Catherine II of Russia. She arrived in Russia at 14 as a minor German princess with no money, no allies, and no guaranteed future. She left it 34 years later, having added over 200,000 square miles of territory to its borders, stretching the empire south to the Black Sea and west into Poland. She founded or refounded more than 140 cities. She corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, built one of the world's great art collections from scratch, and reformed Russian law, education, and administration at a scale no ruler before her had attempted. The numbers are staggering. But numbers alone do not explain why her name still carries weight. Consider the company she keeps. Peter the Great transformed Russia from a medieval kingdom into a northern empire. Elizabeth I of England ruled for 45 years and gave her name to an entire cultural age. Maria Theresa governed the Habsburg Empire through war and crisis with formidable intelligence. These are the figures historians place beside Catherine, and the comparison holds. What distinguishes her is context. Peter inherited his throne. Elizabeth was born to hers. Catherine seized power in a foreign country, held it against every conceivable threat, and expanded it beyond anything her predecessors had imagined. And yet the myths followed her like shadows. The slanders that circulated after her death, stories designed to reduce a powerful woman to a figure of ridicule, persisted precisely because they served a purpose. A woman who commanded armies, outwitted diplomats, and governed 1/6 of the Earth's landmass was a genuinely unsettling proposition for a world that preferred its female rulers to be ornamental. Diminishing her through rumor was easier than reckoning with what she actually accomplished. Russia itself has never quite settled on what to do with her. Soviet historiography cast her as a class enemy, a German usurper who crushed the Pugachev rebellion and kept millions in serfdom. Both charges contain truth. Catherine's Enlightenment ideals collided repeatedly with the political realities of an autocratic state built on unfree labor, and she accommodated those realities more than her correspondence with philosophers would suggest. Greatness and moral complexity have rarely traveled separately. Today, her image presides over St. Petersburg, the city she helped define, and her legacy runs through Russian national identity like a fault line, celebrated and contested in equal measure. She was ruthless, brilliant, lonely, and inexhaustible. She governed by instinct and intellect simultaneously. She understood that power once held must never visibly tremble. The woman who lit her own fire before dawn and ruled until the evening of her last conscious day on Earth left behind an empire transformed beyond recognition. History has debated her character ever since. It has never seriously questioned her greatness. Catherine the Great's 34-year reign proved that greatness recognizes no borders of birth, gender, or circumstance. Subscribe for more stories of the rulers who shaped our world.